Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves, yet it became one of the most dramatic economic collapses of the 21st century. Other oil-producing nations, from Saudi Arabia to Norway, have faced oil price swings but avoided disaster. Why did Venezuela, rich in oil, fail where others survived? To understand, we must look not just at the crisis, but at the history that led to it. Oil was discovered in Venezuela in the early 20th century, and by the 1920s, it had transformed the country's economy. Venezuela went from being primarily an agricultural exporter, cocoa, coffee, and sugar, to a nation dominated by oil wealth. But the wealth came quickly and without strong institutions to manage it. Politically, the oil boom allowed authoritarian rulers, such as Juan Vicente Gómez, to consolidate power, using oil revenues to maintain control. Democracy was limited, governance was centralized, and social programs were minimal. The oil era came before meaningful political reforms or robust democratic institutions could take root. By the mid-20th century, Venezuela's economy was almost entirely dependent on oil. Exports of coffee and agriculture declined, while oil accounted for the majority of foreign income and government revenue. During the 1950s and 1960s, some democratic reforms emerged, including universal suffrage and party competition. But oil wealth often distorted democracy. Governments relied on petro-revenues to maintain political loyalty, fund public spending, and suppress dissent. Economic planning was tied to oil, leaving little room for diversification. The 1970s oil boom brought enormous revenues. The government nationalized oil in 1976, creating PDVSA, the state oil company. Social programs expanded, infrastructure projects multiplied, and Venezuela was once considered one of Latin America's wealthiest countries. But oil dependency deepened. The economy became extremely sensitive to global price swings, and the country failed to invest in other industries. By the early 1980s, Venezuelans were already vulnerable to fluctuations in global oil markets. When oil prices fell in the early 1980s, Venezuela faced its first modern economic crisis. Government debt rose, currency devaluation sparked inflation, and public discontent grew. Structural reforms were delayed, and corruption began to undermine state institutions. While other oil countries like Norway or Saudi Arabia created funds to save revenues during booms, Venezuela spent heavily on immediate social programs and government payrolls, leaving the country exposed when oil prices dropped. In the late 1990s, Hugo Chavez rose to power, promising social justice and redistribution of oil wealth. Initially, high oil prices funded ambitious social programs, gaining mass support. However, the government increasingly centralized power, undermined independent institutions, and politicized PDVSA. Experienced oil engineers and managers were fired or marginalized. Oil revenue became tightly linked to political loyalty rather than technical efficiency. The stage was set for collapse. Dependence on oil was extreme, governance weak, and institutional checks eroded. In 2014, oil prices plummeted from over $100 per barrel to below $40. Venezuela's government faced a severe revenue shortfall. Unlike countries with sovereign wealth funds, diversification, or strong fiscal policy, Venezuela had little buffer. Spending commitments were high, and imports, critical for food, medicine, and industry, became difficult to finance. Hyperinflation followed, currency value collapsed, and public trust eroded. Price controls, forced nationalizations, and currency restrictions made shortages worse. Factories closed, stores ran out of basic goods, and smuggling and corruption surged. Monetary policy worsened inflation, while state subsidies strained the budget further. Other oil countries, even when oil prices fell, maintained reserves, diversified economies, and independent central banks. Tools Venezuela lacked. Corruption accelerated the crisis. Billions of dollars were lost through mismanaged contracts, insider deals, and foreign currency misallocation. With PDVSA politicized, investment in exploration and maintenance declined, and production fell sharply. By 2020, Venezuela's oil output was a fraction of what it had been decades earlier. The collapse of institutions compounded economic fragility, making recovery more difficult. The human cost was enormous. Food, medicine, and basic services became scarce. Millions of Venezuelans fled to neighboring countries, creating one of the largest migration crises in Latin America. The brain drain further weakened the economy. In other oil-producing nations, strong institutions, diversified economies, and social safety nets prevented such a massive humanitarian fallout. Saudi Arabia, Norway, and Kuwait weathered oil price shocks without collapse. Norway's sovereign wealth fund saved oil revenue for future generations. Saudi Arabia invested heavily in infrastructure and diversified the economy while maintaining central bank independence. Venezuela, in contrast, spent all revenue, centralized governance, and politicized the state oil company. The result was vulnerability at the first major shock. Venezuela's story is a warning about over-reliance on a single commodity. Oil came before democracy, shaping political institutions and spending habits. Initial booms were spent, governance was undermined, and oil dependency became a trap. Other nations that combined oil wealth with strong institutions, diversification, and fiscal prudence avoided the same fate. Venezuela shows how history, policy choices, and resource dependence can combine to produce economic collapse. Venezuela had the resources to thrive, but history, politics, and policy decisions created a perfect storm. Oil wealth alone does not guarantee prosperity. Institutions, diversification, and long-term planning are essential. The collapse is a story not just of economics, but of how history shapes a nation's destiny.